And welcome everyone. I'm sure we're going to have a few individuals straggle in as in these first few moments, so we'll throttle back a little bit and just do some introductions and kind of set the stage for our session today. Thank you for taking time. So this topic is foremost on many minds, with January being kind of the inaugural month for um, the precedent-setting CCPA legislation in California. And as we've already seen in the first 2 weeks of this year, this state-based cascade of other data privacy legislation as it begins to unfold. And I think we've seen Nevada and Washington, Virginia, others line up. So it's something that's going to be part of all our lives. And one of the issues, obviously, on everyone's mind is to what degree and when are the federal agencies and legislators and so forth going to get involved. So today we're joined by two individuals who have some really good credentials in this area from two perspectives. Jodi Daniels is the president and founder of Red Clover Advisors. She will give some background on her experience, and she's a high pedigree person in this particular area. Dave Rule is with Heureka. He is with me today. He is director of the product management and development of the Heureka platform, and we'll talk about why that's particularly important in terms of data privacy, data hygiene, and so forth. So just as kind of a review, what we're really trying to cover today are a couple of key topics, and our objectives are really to how to simplify, oops, that got cut off, the key tenets of CCPA and how to simplify and get started. So we're going to talk about the latest updates, what that means. Jodi's going to talk about personal data, which is really at the heart of this issue. So what counts as personal data, and then the who, what, and where of that personal data, and then how does CCPA cause you to not only act and behave, but also respond in terms of compliance. And then Dave is going to walk us through some really important key things to keep in mind in terms of getting your arms around the data. Where is this data and how you mitigate it and remediate it and so forth. So I'm going to give just a real brief background on Heureka. I'm going to hand it off to Jodi. Jodi will give a little background on herself, and then she'll begin to go through the first part. So Heureka software was begun in 2013, really in the industry of legal e-discovery and digital forensics. And the main issue that we saw with litigation preparation was this ever-increasing, exponentially growing mound of unstructured data, which represents as much as 80% of data in any given enterprise. And when litigators begin to prep for matters that have come before them, what they have to do is begin to sort through those mounds of data and try to find anything that's relevant in preparation for that particular litigation. So our platform was built to get your arms around that unstructured data with some speed and some improved economics. There are institutions that have demonstrated that really the discovery and collection of data is where most of the cost is associated with e-discovery. What we found, though, was the way our platform performs is really key to unstructured data, but in other areas, key to any given organization. And as GRC, the compliance and risk mitigation and information governance become more important, finding out where that data is and mapping that data. And then sometimes, you need to quarantine that data or delete it just because either it's dangerous to hang on to, it's risky, or it's no longer of use to the organization. And the architecture is really what gives us the performance edge. We have a distributed architecture. We won't go much into the details, but it gives us the ability to manage that data where it lives, at rest, where it's created, and it just performs better because of that particular architecture. And then last year, we introduced advanced classification and tagging, which is an automatic function of our platform. It identifies PII. It identifies some of the content associated with that PII, and it might identify, for example, social security numbers. It might identify badge numbers or anything that might have to do with medical records. So we'll touch on that just a little bit. But I want to introduce Jodi. And Jodi, if you would please just give us some background and give me the nod, and we'll get started.
Good. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being so patient. Gotta love technology. It is a pleasure to meet all of you, and I'm glad to be here. So thank you again for the technical difficulties. It wouldn't be a webinar without them. As Tim had shared, I have a privacy consultancy called Red Clover Advisors, and we're all about helping companies on the operational aspects of privacy. So we have these privacy laws, and what do we do with them? How do we figure out what needs to actually happen from data mapping? We're going to dig in deep into understanding the types of data that we have, but also answering all kinds of questions, staying on top of future privacy laws, process, training employees, and serving as a fractional privacy officer. You can see here a bit of the credentials. I come with a variety of business experience from big corporates, and I am a certified privacy professional. So excited to dig in with you today. What we wanted to do is make sure everyone understands what CCPA is, the California Consumer Privacy Act, and kind of use that to set the stage. So most of you are likely familiar that it became effective January 1st, 2020, so we're 15 days in, and it will actually start being enforced July 1st. You might also be seeing, kind of hot off the press and not on this slide, there's a bunch of different copycat laws that are coming up. So really understanding what CCPA is all about is really important. At the heart of CCPA is granting users, individual customers, rights over their data. An individual gives the company their data, and what can I do with it? What kind of control do I have? So it's about making sure that companies now have to honor an individual right that I, as a consumer, might ask of a company. And there's a couple different very specific individual rights that a company needs to adhere to. There's also a shift about making sure that companies are responsible for data protection. If there's a third-party vendor, cloud partner that we might be working with, or even just any third party we transfer data to, a lot of times businesses said, well, that's, I've transferred it to the third party. That's their job. And instead, it's really both companies' responsibility. And to make sure that companies were paying attention, there's some financial penalties at stake. It can be $7,500 for each intentional violation, $2,500 for each unintentional violation. There's also an individual private right of action under certain situations with the data breach. So if the data is unencrypted or not redacted, then there's the ability to have an individual private right of action. A lot of people are very concerned this will turn into class action lawsuits. So, we're 15 days in, we'll kind of have to wait and see as to how that pans out. Another consequence is really, that I see often, is the loss of sales, especially between B2B companies, where company A requires company B to comply, and in the contract will have those specifications. And if company B is not ready, then it's not going to be able to fulfill that contract and potentially have the loss of sale. Tim, if we can move to the next slide. Wonderful. So when we're talking about CCPA and data, what kind of data are we even talking about? It's been PII, personally identifiable information, for a really long time. And we're shifting to personal information in California. If you've had to comply with GDPR, you might have heard of personal data. They're pretty similar, and the concept is it's really expanding the idea of only if it was identifiable. So you have your common identifiers, your name, address, there might be a unique identifier, email, physical address, social security number, things along those lines, but also biometric data. Think fingerprint, voice recognition, retina scan, health information. And this does not have to be just HIPAA covered information, but really anything that might qualify as health data. Financial information, and a lot of times when I talk to folks, they only think about, oh, well, I don't have any financial information, so it's okay. Well, financial information is one of the categories of information that we need to be mindful of, but not the only one. Precise geolocation. So think on your phone, the little location pops up, especially for weather oftentimes. That's precise geolocation. If it's inferred from an IP, that's location information, that's different, still need to disclose it, but it's not quite precise geolocation. So think about all the technologies today with GPS, really important to be able to disclose that type of information, ask for permission, and be able to allow an individual to maybe say, I don't want you to know my precise location anymore. I want you to opt out of that. And then also sort of commercial information is also potentially considered, like your purchase history. You might have, Jodi bought this shirt for $10. That's commercial information, but you had my name connected to it. Tim, you're good. You can keep going. Thank you. So what does all this mean to the business? What are you responsible for? Well, you need to review your contracts. I mentioned that the responsibility of protecting data has really shifted. It can't just be that third party you passed it to. You also have to own that responsibility. You have to make sure you know what vendor are you working with? Who are they? What type of information are you sending to them? How are they protecting it? What are their privacy and security practices? Are they using it for any other types of purposes? And all of that should be in the contract, as well as how that third party might support you in honoring individual rights. So if I share my information to another company, I, Jodi, am going to go to the brand to say, I want you to delete my information. I, as the business, have to then go to the third party or the service provider to figure out, well, how do I actually honor Jodi's request? How do I do that? And a big part of that's going to be training employees. Your employees need to know about CCPA. It's actually a specific requirement, is anyone who will be a part and responsible for compliance on CCPA needs to be trained. Think about your customer service team, your sales team, your marketing team, anyone who has a touch point with customers. They might receive the question about privacy, and they need to know where to direct those questions, and just some high-level bullet points about what to say. And then those that are going to be processing requests need to have a very complete plan. And this is not a one and done. So a lot of times it's about understanding the data, coming up with a privacy notice. Maybe you've seen your cookie banner, you've informed your customers, you check the box, you move on. Except you actually need to come up with an ongoing plan, because this is really something that is, we're building the foundation with our policies and understanding our data. And then we need to figure out, how do we maintain that on an ongoing basis? And to do that, we've got to know the data. You have to know what you collect, what you use, what you share, whom it's going to, and under CCPA, what you sell. CCPA has a very unique definition of sell. It does not just mean I sold it to you for $1. It can mean I gave it to you, you're using it for some other purpose. You're not just a service provider to me. That could be joint partnerships, affiliates, sponsorships, just a lot of, or actually a sale where there might not be money specifically involved. So critical to be able to know your data. That is the absolute foundation block to complying with CCPA.
So Jodi, this is Tim. There have been, and whether or not you're Googling for the topic or not, public forums and then in meetings and so forth, there's a lot of conversation and question around, if they're GDPR compliant, then does that match up and then prepare me better for CCPA?
It's a great question, and I get that all the time. It's a great starting point, but they are different. For starters, a lot of companies only dealt with the EU data, not the US data. And you also might have been looking at it a little bit differently, especially when it comes to the sale of data. It's very unique. GDPR does not go into that level of detail on this interesting slice when it comes to the sale of data. So if you've had to comply with GDPR, it's an excellent start. There is still work to be done from a CCPA perspective, and the privacy notice requirements are different. We don't have the legal basis acknowledgement, so, and the individual rights also differ a little bit, and the time frame differs as well.
Okay, so someone just typed a question. I'll read this to you. As other states introduce legislation, how do we best navigate that legislation, and how do we track this? Or, I guess in my own words, you know, how do you begin to get your arms around this?
It's definitely going to be something that we're all going to have to pay attention to. And literally just this week, or in the last 5 days, we've had Nebraska, Washington, and today I saw Florida hit. You're going to have a lot of copycat bills. This is legislative season, and you know, not all of them that are introduced are going to pass. So, you know, either set up your Google RSS feed, find a service provider that you know and trust, and you can keep up with them, you know, on social media or emails. But this is certainly the start. I firmly believe we will have more CCPAs at the end of the legislative session. Exactly what they look like, it's still a little bit too early to tell. This needs to be part of the ongoing plan. So knowing that there was this one law, we kind of complied and we're done and we moved on, it doesn't work. We have to be able to make sure that we have factored in, how are we going to keep up with that? Do we need a service? Do we have a trusted service provider? Do we know someone who's going to be able to help support us and inform us of any updates to our business, and really getting someone to know your business and be able to determine, this applies to you, this doesn't apply to you.
So maybe it's too early to tell, I'm not sure, but do the other legislation being introduced, do they appear to be copycat to CCPA, or is there nuance, anything glaring that's a big difference?
There's a few. Some are a little bit more narrow, kind of like Nevada, where the sale of data has to be it's a very narrow slice for sale, but it's not only sale. Some of them, like Washington State, does not have an individual private right of action, but is actually a little bit more restrictive overall, but it doesn't have that hook. It has the Attorney General, or kind of like a legal affairs department, on the hook. Florida is a little bit similar. Well, they're all just kind of like a little bit different. I think you're going to have some states that literally are going to copy CCPA. It's what happened last year. And then you're going to have other states that are going to narrow in on the sale of data. Others are going to be on the individual rights. So you'll probably see a smorgasbord of options.
Okay. Well, and as you so eloquently transitioned to know your data, I mean, that's really at the heart of this, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to hand it over to Dave. And Dave is product director, manager, not only background in legislative workflow, or, you know, litigation, I should say litigation prep workflow, but also a technical background. Dave, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And
hello,
Dave,
can you hear me?
yes, sorry.
Hey, no problem, Tim. Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna just jump in where Jodi kind of left off, and talk about this world of unstructured data. And it was something Tim was talking at the top of the hour. And it's obviously of critical importance to a lot of people, especially larger enterprises. And so we are really narrowly focused on, Heureka in particular is really narrowly focused on unstructured data. So a lot of people say, hey, what is, you know, unstructured data? Unstructured data really accounts today, in most enterprises, it accounts for 80% of all corporate data. And really that unstructured data, really the way you can think about it is all of that data that's sitting around on desktops, on laptops, on file shares, that really does not have a structure. It's not sitting in a database. It is just really loosely gathered up, and it is sitting in all kinds of places across the enterprise. Again, not in a database, but just kind of loosely sitting there. And it's been collecting for years and years. And this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of talking about trying to wrangle that information and trying to figure out what you have in the unstructured data world. And you can see in that middle slide there, corporate data is growing 63% every year. So it's not like the unstructured data goes away or magically disappears. It may be archived, it may be moved from point A to point B, and in many enterprises, it may actually move from an in-house server to the cloud. But at the end of the day, that unstructured data still lives, and you still have to account for it. And one of the things we also talk about when we talk about unstructured data is redundant, obsolete, and trivial information. So you can imagine any organization that's been running, for quite a long time, they're going to have a lot of redundant and obsolete information. So, a file gets created, it gets spread around the enterprise. Another file gets created, movies get created, presentations, accounting, you name it. So those files are out there. And we talk a lot about, redundancy of that information. It may be obsolete. We may have a data retention policy that could be 5, 6, 7 years old, but the data just, perhaps is not looked at, and it becomes stale. So you can see there, 70 cents of every dollar is spent on cybersecurity and compliance and privacy to manage and protect data that has no business, legal, or regulatory value. So at the end of the day, a lot of money is being spent on data that in a lot of cases, has not been looked at or has become stale, or it's trivial and has no business being in the enterprise. Okay, next slide there, Tim. So here we talk about the real big problem, which is no visibility in that information. So as I said, a lot of that data, it's just been out there, it's been collecting, it's been stored, it's been archived, it's been moved to a cloud. But at the end of the day, we don't have much visibility into the information. In a structured data world, obviously that's a little bit different, because in structured data, many of the systems have search engines. Some of them have very robust search engines to allow you to go across the databases and look for that information and find out where information is stored. In the unstructured data world, it's quite the opposite. So companies really have little or no visibility into their unstructured data in many instances, especially what we see today. And I think Tim can attest to this. The larger the corporate client, the less visibility they seem to have in their own data. Data silos obviously making difficult to monitor and track the data as it moves, even more so in cloud. It's hard to separate the business critical data from that rot, that redundant, obsolete, and trivial information. And the financial impact to all of this at the end of the day, when we really tie this in with things like the privacy laws that are coming into play, is that information that is everywhere in an organization with zero visibility can cost you a lot of money if something happens. All right, and unfortunately the problem does get worse. So as we talk about that growth factor, you can see what happens with data growth, from year 1 to year 2 to year 3. That information is growing, over 60% per year. And so what happens is the data just continues to grow and grow and grow, and it becomes, at some point almost unmanageable. And without the visibility into that, life gets worse for a lot of folks. And really, at the end of the day, the risk is obviously real, because we all read about this. We're all hearing about this, online on the news. That information that is risky, internally sitting there becomes very real very quick if there's a data breach, or if people are, if ransomware is put into place. And these are just a few of the companies over the past probably 2 to 3 years that have seen data breaches, and really large ones. Everyone, of course, knows about, probably the Equifax and Marriott, and a few years back before that was the Target breach. So this is information that, is sitting there that, really has value. If there is personal information involved, can really have value to outside hackers and people that are breaching systems, because they love to get that PI information and steal identities and things like that. So we showed this in a little a graphical form. This is really for CCPA preparation. We talk about data hygiene. Data hygiene is really, keeping track of your information and understanding what you have. And you can see that people care less. So we have ambiguity, and there's no reaction to anything in a lot of cases. They just, a lot of corporations, they buy more servers, they buy more cloud space. They don't have the data intelligence there, so they have a save all kind of mentality that many people have. So, as the intelligence actually begins to gain steam in any place, that it gives companies the ability to react on information. Once you're able to react on information, maybe we know what our unstructured data, what kind of content our unstructured data has. We begin to become more resilient, and obviously our risk begins to go down, and we're able to respond and remediate to information that's in our unstructured data world. So our preparation for this, if we look at it, the one thing that we always talk about is, and I think Jodi touched on this as well, is data inventory. The discovery phase of this whole thing has to be a real knowledge and understanding of the data that any organization has. So, that discover piece is obviously really huge. It's always been a problem in the unstructured data world because there were traditionally no tools that would cover that information. The next piece to this is really minimize our data. So can we, as we're going through our discovery phase, can we look at our information and begin to make intelligence decisions? Is it redundant? Is it obsolete? Is it past our data retention policy? Is it trivial information? Do we have a whole bunch of movie files sitting there for absolutely no reason, taking up space? Now, there may not be no risk as far as the organization goes. So that might not be a risky problem, but it can be in the long term. You're paying for storage, you're paying to move it from point A to point B. Those things can really help the bottom line if you're able to clean up that information. Organizing your data, obviously, it all comes into play when we know what our data is. We're able to push some things out of the way that we don't need, and we're being able to organize that information. That is going to allow us to do a lot of things, in terms of cybersecurity. We can protect our data in a better way. We can put it in a more protected location. We can delete it off of maybe the endpoints that we don't need it to be sitting on. And we're able to classify information, which allows us to do all that. So classification is a big component of this whole thing. And then in the long term, we're able to monitor that information, because once we have software put into place that is able to do this type of thing, we're able to monitor it long term as well, and help us take action on information. So our step one for all of this, we go a little bit deeper, is the discovery phase of data. So again, understand what data you have, create an inventory map. That's one of the things when we talk about Heureka software, when we're able to deploy to desktops, laptops, and file shares. We had this discovery within usually the first 24 hours on smaller computers, where we can create data inventory maps. So know your data, know your file age, verify what your retention policy is going to be. And then we have all kinds of really great things like looking at file types and category information. We can look at file sizes, we can look at duplicates. So all of that really comes together in a data map of the system that's there, which allows us to start making really intelligent decisions about the information, right? You go to that phase two, we're trying to minimize, again, we're trying to minimize the information that we have. So eliminate our rot, get rid of redundant, obsolete, and trivial information. Your duplicates are out there. Let's go find duplicates and get those out of the system. If we have a data retention policy, we're going to start taking a look at that, find out what kind of data is outside the retention, and then decide, make really intelligent choices about what we're going to do with that data. Do we save it? Do we cold store it? Do we simply remove it or delete it? And then trivial information, same thing there. Really old access dates. Nobody's looking at this stuff. It has zero business value. Let's get rid of it. Let's take action and get rid of that information. That third step was a really big one when we're talking about CCPA or any of the privacy laws, GDPR as well, is identify and protect your private information or personal information. So this is a huge one, and we have a classification engine that runs that helps to identify this information automatically. And so the best thing there really is users not having to really do the heavy lifting to try to identify some of this information. The software is actually doing that for you. So we do have automatic classifications of the kind of the classic personal information, or as Jodi said, PII personally identifying information like credit cards, social securities, and things like that. And then, you know, the ability for users to be able to go in and automatically, have the system look for very personal data to their organization. So regex comes into play there, where we're looking for badge IDs, medical record numbers, things like that. Finally, our step 4 there is the monitor. So we talked a little bit
Dave,
about that. Yeah.
Just what? So Dave was actually involved in an organization back in December, and they took a look at one file share. I believe the value of the PI found on that was over $5 million. So you don't know until you know, and that's the starting point for all of this is just figuring out what's really there. So
yeah, and it's definitely true. And I think, Tim, you and I know this just from doing it. The file shares are the ones that are really kind of the black holes for most organizations. It's the one place where all the data is getting dumped. And unfortunately, today, some of that information is just automatically being pushed out to the cloud sources. So we're pushing things now, or corporations are pushing things, more toward the clouds. So people are storing a lot of PII information in the cloud. So we see a lot less of that when we're doing these assessment reports that Heureka does. We see a lot less risk on an endpoint level, where we're down at the user's laptop or desktop computer. We really see it really on the file shares, because that's obviously there's a lot more data there to begin with, but obviously it's a place where a lot of people store information, and many organizations have that mapped drive, the S drive for the corporation, where people have their own personal folder up on the cloud where they're able to dump data. So that's obviously a common place where we see a lot of PI data being put. Okay, so monitoring. So this is obviously huge, right? So we've done our other steps. We've done 1 through 3. We've identified information and made some intelligence decisions about getting rid of information. The idea behind all this is you want to keep going, right? We reached a stage in doing all this, but you can't stop. You have to continuously monitor the information that is being generated on a daily basis, really. Because remember, again, this data is 63% per year on unstructured data. So really what we need to do there is we need to monitor this information. And so we're going to create things like scheduled searching and continuous classification of information that allows you to monitor and closely monitor the information so that you can come back through, maybe on a quarterly basis. We do have users who actually on a monthly basis will go through and just take a quick glance at the systems that they have. Or they may do a drive-by on a couple of the systems that they have. They don't go and scan everything. And just take a look and see where they stand in terms of compliance in terms of PI, and then make logical choices based on that. Is this new data that's showing up? Do the correct custodians have access to this information, or has this data propagated itself outside of kind of a fixed custodian list? So that is the type of stuff that we talk about when we're talking about monitoring of information. We want to do that, after we've done that initial assessment. We want to keep on monitoring and keep on, cleaning up data and organizing our data. Responded to CCPA. So obviously, one of the things that clients have the ability to do is they're able to, in many cases now, ask a corporation what kind of information they have on them. So we have consumer requests, that are coming in. We had one client who was seeing this even before CCPA came online. They were getting 1 or 2 a day a year ago, and then it just ratcheted itself up and up and up as more of these privacy laws come into play, where they're getting requests to say, I want you to get rid of my information, or I want you to give me a report of the information that you have. So that becomes a little bit, it's fairly simple to respond to that. It's man time, obviously, to do it, or there's human involvement in that. But the one traditional area where, again, it's been a black hole has been on that unstructured data side. So when we talk about responding to CCPA, The important thing there is to be able to run some type of query across that unstructured data and to look for that information and then be able to report on it. So when users are coming back to a corporate client, they're not saying, okay, I can only show you 3 of my databases that I do have search capability for. We're able to, because we have this system in place with unstructured data, we're able to go in and do a much more complete report because we have access to the information that's held inside unstructured data. So that gives them a much better 360 view of the information and frankly a better reporting structure for the information that the client may want to see. So that is a big one when it comes to CCPA, is we need to obviously respond to the subjects in a reasonable time frame, or what's in the legal time frame, and we need to give them a report on the type of information. The one thing there is, as far as we're concerned, is the ability to actually delete that information. That does become a little bit more problematic depending on what system you're on, but we do have a tool set that allows users to respond to a delete or remove of my information, removal of my information. So we do have the ability to do that with the Heureka system. Finally, kind of summing this whole thing up, really, it's the discover, minimize, organize, monitor, right? It's the 4 points that we talk about quite a bit with our users and put into play with many of them. Know what you have, minimize or try to minimize the amount of information you have, organize what's left over, and just continuously monitor as you go along.
So Dave, a couple questions that we often get. So you talked about types of PI. So on the other end, so what kind of systems can I access? And talk a little bit about, what's out there in terms of, what type of operating system and so forth, if you would.
Oh yeah, so if we get to that level, Tim, usually, we tell people, obviously it's very broad for us. So we are covering really all the operating systems as a platform. So we get down right to the endpoint level. So we literally hit endpoints that are running Windows, Mac, or Linux. And we get the desktops, we get the laptops. But more importantly, I think we talked about this a lot. We talked about file shares. And so it's the one area where a lot of people really struggle, and the file shares really are those black holes. So we need to be able to cover those, and that's what we do. And most of those are Linux. It's going to be a Linux-based operating system, and then you obviously secondarily have Windows that would run that.
Yeah, and often we hear concerns about people who might be traveling globally, and then what happens? They go offline. They're going to Beijing, and then they're offline for a couple of days. Yet they pop their laptop, they get on the network, and we haven't missed a beat. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's true. So the system is architected in a way that it is able to, as long as you have an active internet connection, you are able to basically handshake back to the
All right, you got a little bit muffled there, Dave, but I think you're back.
Sorry about that.
It's all right.
The short answer was, Tim, yes, we cover offline.
Okay, all right. So I want to thank everyone for their patience as we had some technical difficulty. I'll take responsibility for that. I appreciate your patience and your attention. I want to really thank Jodi and Dave for all the prep time and for providing their time today. Here is the contact information. What I will do over the next 24, 48 hours is we'll get this, we'll get kind of a, take two or second showing, if you will. We'll get it up on our channel. We'll also make the slides available. And if anyone has any final questions, raise your hand. All right, I don't see anybody raising hands. Thank you again, everybody. Jodi? Dave,
Yeah.
did you have a question for Jodi?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of questions about the documentation that needs to happen, Jodi, and I just really kind of wanted to round around what we talked about, what I was talking about, with the reporting structure, and what kind of documentation is really kind of required for these corporations, when they get requests and their compliance with CCPA. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. From a data mapping perspective, CCPA does not have the same level of very specific required from a law documentation like GDPR does. However, you need to, especially from a security standpoint, you need a information security program. If there were ever to be a breach, one of the very first things that any regulator is going to ask you is, show me your policy. From a training perspective, you're going to want to document when you've trained people, because again, if there's any kind of issue, you can say, well, we've trained. And overall, it's kind of impossible not to go through the data exercise to understand what you have. So while the law might not very specifically require, like in GDPR, an Article 30 report or a record of processing activity, most companies are going forward with a data inventory, data mapping exercise that is documented and is maintained on an ongoing basis. That does help from any type of issue, from being able to write your privacy notice, managing individual rights. And again, if there's ever a question of what your program is, then you have that information to be able to show.
Excellent. And so here's another one quick, Jodi, for you. We've heard a lot of people say, oh, when we're talking to larger enterprises, they're basically like, hey, we're doing GDPR already. We're already good for these privacy laws in the United States. Is that a true statement from what you know?
Yeah, well, so we talked a little bit about that too. It's not. I mean, it's a great start. All the laws are a little bit different. They have some basic fundamentals that they share. They're about informing the user. They're about offering individual rights. The definition of personal information or data is kind of similar, but they're still different. You have to have different requirements in your notice. So if anyone's read any of the privacy emails that you've likely received in your inbox, you'll see there's like a California section and an EU section. And that's because the requirements are literally different. How a company is going to manage the process, also a little bit different. So if you had to comply or get started for GDPR, if you haven't complied, but you are going to get started, good idea, then it's similar. Highly recommend doing GDPR, CCPA, whatever new acronyms come along at the same time. But they are, you can't just ignore CCPA because you did GDPR last year.
Right.
Not to mention, it should be this ongoing thing. So if we end up with 10 states at the end of the year, it shouldn't be 10 different exercises. It should be, you kind of have this starting point, and then you might have to line up the different state requirements and see what's different. So a lot of it will be similar as a starting point.
Great, but you're not blanket covered just because you did one. Yeah.
No.
Yep. So there's my recommendation for hiring someone like yourself who can help people navigate through that.
Yeah, and it's critical to know the data. I mean, you cannot do these compliance exercises if you have no idea what you have. So
Right.
It is the foundation, core, most critical piece.
Right. Excellent. Thank you so much, Jodi. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, Jodi, your expertise is unmatched, so thank you very much. So we'll wrap up here if there are no further questions. Thanks to all the participants. Thanks to Dave and Jodi. And we'll be wrapping this up and getting this out to everybody before the week is out. Everyone have a good rest of the week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jodi.
Bye-bye.